Right. So welcome everybody to today's presentation, Sexual Violence Against Native Women, Past and Present. We are so lucky to have Floripa with us here today from the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. Floripa is a two-spirit auntie from the Pueblo of Isleta and Navajo Nation. She received her BA in Ethnic Studies at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And while studying at Brown University, Floripa found her passion for work against issues of violence, especially sexual violence. And now at the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, Floripa is interested in working in solidarity with Black and Indigenous voices against sexual violence. Floripa, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kelsey. Welcome everyone. I'm so excited to join you all today and to learn about sexual violence against Native women. I just really want to preface this by saying it's important to prioritize your self-care and community care. So just make sure to, if you came here with someone, to check in with them because some of the material in this presentation can be sort of hard to hear at times. So I just want to be mindful of that. So with that, so thank you so much for the introduction. This is just me saying who I am again. I also just want to note that for this workshop, just to make sure that you have grounding tools nearby, such as Play-Doh or stress ball or a fidget spinner, if that helps with your learning, and then also to just keep water and healthy snacks and fruit nearby, and to take breaks as needed. With that, I wanted just to begin discussing a little bit about the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. So the Coalition is an award-winning organization at the forefront to a dynamic approach to tribal domestic violence and sexual violence. And we really work with preventing the cycle of violence within tribal communities. But I do want to say that we are not a direct service provider. We work in coalition with others to really support what is going on at the ground level. And so our service area is located in the New Mexico region for the majority of it. We serve the Navajo Nation and the Isleta del Sur in Texas as well, and then also in the Four Corners area. We also have 4 focus areas, which are training, technical assistance, policy advocacy, and support. That is how I'm able to join you all today, is just through the support that we're able to provide to other organizations. Just to provide a little bit more detail, we were founded in 1996 by three Native women, Peggy Bird of Kiowa Pueblo, Darlene Correa of Laguna Pueblo, and Jenny James of Navajo Nation. And we were created to provide support to other Native advocates working in domestic violence and sexual assault. So our real goal is to eliminate violence against Native women and children. Now 2 decades later from its creation, the Coalition continues to be a resource for training and support, as well as technical assistance and policy advocacy. So I just want to provide an overview of the training objectives, just to give you an idea of what we'll be covering. So I want to provide information about the statistics of sexual violence against Native women as it stands today. I also want to discuss the impacts of contact with Europeans and colonization. Then I'll provide an overview of vocabulary, such as the definition of sexual violence, rape culture, and gender-based violence. I really wanted to provide this vocabulary so that it provides a kind of context of the relevance to tribal communities, and why it's important to learn these terms in the lens of tribal communities as well. And then also I want to discuss support for survivors, and as well as the importance of believing survivors. So with that, I will begin with a discussion on violence against Native women. So as it currently stands now, 84% of Native women, or 4 in 5, have experienced violence in their lifetime. About over half, at 56.1% of Native women have experienced sexual violence, and 55.5% have been physically hurt by an intimate partner. Around 48.8% have been a victim of stalking, and 66.4% have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner. As it stands today, more than 1.5 million Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. In the interest of having fostering solidarity and just being mindful of our relatives who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer, or two-spirit, I wanted to provide some context regarding violence against our two-spirit and LGBTQ relatives. And for me, I just want to say that it's just so important to talk about this because I think that when we think about colonization as imposition to the ways in life and the ways in which different tribal communities had their own ways of conduct, there was an influence to change those ways to conform and assimilate into European culture, into the dominant American narrative. But one thing that Lenny Hayes, advocate for two-spirit and LGBTQ people, says is, while there's no accurate data that represents the rate of domestic and sexual violence that occurs within two-spirit and Native LGBTQ community, it occurs all the same. Unfortunately, this lack of data creates the false idea that domestic violence and sexual violence are not experienced within this community. And so we have some data that talks about how 40% of lesbian women and 61% of bisexual women, compared to 35% of heterosexual women, experience rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. As for, in terms of gay men, 25% of gay men and 37% of bisexual men, compared to 29% of heterosexual men, experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime. So one thing I always like to request people reflect on is just the ways in which the ways in which gender roles kind of transforms itself through time. So before colonization, many Native communities had their own ways of expressing themselves. And to me, that has a very important impact on the ways in which Native women and Native LGBTQ and two-spirit relatives are impacted by the violence, both in the past and today. I want to provide some information on sexual violence in tribal communities. About 1 in 3 Native women have experienced some form of sexual assault, and Native women are 2.5 times more likely to experience rape than other women in the nation. This is really important to contextualize alongside the issue regarding missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and transgender and two-spirit relatives, because sexual violence really is one of those indicators that perpetuates sex trafficking and shows that there is instances of sex trafficking happening. And the missing and murdered crisis is a result of that as well. So I've touched a little bit upon the past in terms of what context the result of contact, and I will go further in the next slide about that as well to contextualize it further. But what I really wanted to talk about here is just that in many tribal nations, violence is not traditional. And for me, I speak from my own tribe's background. I'm from Isleta, Pueblo, and Navajo Nation. And so in my perspective, what I like to share is that we have strong belief systems about respecting and having reverence for Native women. And there is a means for community and restorative justice. And also that many tribes are known for having more so egalitarian practices. So rather than having a patriarchy or a matriarchy, many tribes are known for having a more egalitarian society. And this kind of shows that in those systems, accountability is at the individual level, and it translates to the whole collective as well. And the issue about the traditionality of violence and nonviolence is that colonization really impacted the ways in which we were subjugated to a lot of violence. And so I know that there is a quote from Renee Brown who says, hurt people hurt people. And so I like to share that just because I think that in the context of our communities now, in thinking of prevention, it's just important to really check in with somebody who is hurting or might be causing harm to others, to see if their hurt is causing them to hurt others. So with that, I want to share a quote to contextualize the historical narrative around sexual violence as a tool of oppression against Native people in North America and throughout the Americas. During the expeditions to the Americas, there were accounts that were kept as part of the expedition. And in one of the accounts, it talks about Columbus kidnapping a Carib woman and giving her to a crew member to rape. And I just want to read the quote that Michel de Cuneo says about that event. He says on page 143, while I was in the boat, I captured a very beautiful woman whom the Lord Admiral Columbus gave to me. When I had taken her to my cabin, she was naked, as was their custom. I was filled with a desire to take my pleasure with her and attempted to satisfy my desire. She was unwilling and so treated me with her nails that I wish I had never begun. I then took a piece of rope and whipped her soundly, and she let forth such incredible screams that you would not have believed your ears. Eventually we came to such terms, I assure you, that you would have thought she had been brought up in a school for whores. I just want everyone to take like a deep breath. It can be very hard to hear the kind of accounts about what was going on at the time of contact and the early interactions with Europeans during that time. And so I want to take a moment now to ask whether anyone is familiar with this painting. Share in the comments whether you've seen this painting before. All right, so I'm saying that some of y'all have, so this is a painting called Manifest Destiny. And what it depicts is the impacts of colonization. And it's really set forth to kind of show the ways in which those who are settling upon the land interact with the land versus the ways in which indigenous peoples were being targeted for their land, and especially with regards to the ways in which Native women were targeted. And so this is a really great painting kind of showing that the justification of religion and also technology to push Native Americans westward, but also to in the picture we can also see the creation of like telephone lines and the train system while Native peoples are running and also buffalo are running in the background as well. So this really shows like the impact of what Western expansion has how it's affected Native peoples so far. So in terms of colonization and violence, there was a lot of murder and genocide, and the kind of insertion of the patriarchy into tribal communities, in the sense that for a lot of for early European contact, many tribes had to shift the ways in which they organized their leadership or also chose their representation due to the gender norms of settlers in the area. So a lot of settlers would only speak to those that they perceive as men or male, and that had an impact on our own culture and tribal community, because for a lot of tribal communities we had to adjust and figure out how to kind of cope with the imposition of a new leadership system of patriarchy as part of settler colonialism. And so it's really important to understand that settler colonialism is an invasion, that invasion is a structure and not an event. So it's an ongoing structure. And it will exist as long as settlers are living in appropriated land, and thus still exists today. In the context of like institutional racism, it's really important to understand that that the violence against Native women is a part of the institutional and structural racism that exists today. And so Some further examples of that are also within recent history, the boarding school era, in which many people experienced child sexual abuse. And also on top of that, the separation from their families. So colonization was a was one of was the was a power and control model on a massive scale. And I will go further into discussing what the power and control model looks like. But it really shows that for Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, that the hierarchy model is not a natural facet for our communities. So before I go into the next slide, I just want to ask you if you had any questions. I'll have a question part about the vocabulary later on, but if you have any questions so far, just let me know. So if not, I'll move on. So I just wanted to discuss sexual violence to define it. So just to start off, sexual violence is any sexual behavior that happens without a person's consent. And this can be rape, incest, marital rape, statutory rape, forced oral sex, child sexual abuse, or sexual harassment. All of these fall under the framework of sexual violence. And the spectrum of violence really goes alongside this power and control model. So the spectrum can really include a lot of what I detailed in the previous slide, but it can also include actions that are such as whistling or a verbal comment, and these actions, I think I like to contextualize them with Native sovereignty. So it's important to think about how your sovereignty, your personal sovereignty, is like what I've been taught is the width of your arm to. So if that is your own personal space, and so you have to have consent to enter within that realm. And so sovereignty kind of takes that is sort of like the power and control model, in that for your own sovereignty, you are able to decide who you give consent to. And I say this just because the colonization of this land was a real kind of violation of the consent of a lot of Native peoples. And so understanding consent, which I will get into in the next slide, is really important. So I just want to detail a little bit about consent. So consent is an agreement between participants to engage in sexual activity. I also want to expand this to say it's really to engage in any act that that impedes on a person's personal space, and consent should really be clearly and freely communicated. A verbal and affirmative expression of consent can help both you and your partner understand and respect each other's boundaries. I also want to know that consent cannot be given by individuals who are underage, intoxicated, or incapacitated by drugs or alcohol, or asleep and or unconscious. If someone agrees to an activity under pressure of intimidation or threat, that is not considered consent because it's not freely given. Unequal power dynamics, such as engaging in sexual activity with an employee or student, also means that consent cannot be freely given. So I want to talk a little bit about rape culture, because it impacts us, it impacts everybody who is impacted by the patriarchy um in our society as it stands right now. And so rape culture is a culture in which sexual violence is treated as the norm, and victims are blamed for their own assaults. It's not just about sexual violence itself, but about cultural norms and institutions that protect rapists, promote impunity, shame victims, and demand that women make unreasonable sacrifices to avoid sexual assault. To illustrate this, I wanted to discuss a little bit about victim blaming alongside rape culture. And I wanted to do this by illustrating what happened with regards to immediate response when a girl was raped. And so CNN reacted by saying that the boys were promising students. ABC News reacted by making excuses for the rapist. And then NBC News lamented the boys' promising football careers. And USA Today stressed that the victim was intoxicated during the assault. And so I wanted to ask that if you could put in the chat to list examples of where you see examples of this happening in your community, whether it be a comment or an action, and then just to reflect on where do these beliefs stem from.
I'm just gonna find them.
And then if you can just think of ways you can address it as well. But feel free to put it in the chat. Daniel Walker said asking for it and then saying what they were wearing or what were they wearing. These are really great examples of victim blaming that happens. And then Nani says demonizing survivors for speaking up. That is definitely a really important point. One thing I really like to say to people working in community addressing sexual assault is that the incident that occurs isn't when a survivor speaks up. Like that's not the controversy. The pain and the crime happened when the person was sexually assaulted, not when the survivor is speaking up about it. And so for me, it's important to make that distinction that in addressing like the trauma that a community goes through when they're addressing sexual assault. Amanda Carrington said the ways that people talk about the Cosby or R. Kelly cases always blame the victims. Yes, definitely. Kelly DeCapua says girls' outfits in schools and are responsible for distracting boys. That's a really important issue, and I think it really shows that rape culture is present even in all the way from our early years of childhood to throughout life, and just like we need to find ways to address that and combat that. Lindsay Jones, so there are a lot of examples that y'all are giving, and I think that this is just so important, just to know the ways in which we can victim blame. So later on in this presentation, I'll give some ways to support survivors. So just think about these examples that are listed. So thank you so much for participating. So I'm gonna go over gender-based violence, and then I really want to share with you 2 videos, so I want to make sure that we have time for that. So I'm going to try to go over this. And if you have any questions, just feel free to put it in the chat. And so gender-based violence includes rape, sexual assault, intimate partner violence in heterosexual and gay partnerships, as well as sexual harassment, stalking, and sex trafficking. This type of violence really undermines the health and dignity and security and autonomy of its victims, and but it's not often talked about. And so victims of gender-based violence can suffer sexual and reproductive health consequences, such as forced and unwanted pregnancies, unsafe abortions, traumatic fistula, and sexually transmitted infections, including HIV, or even death. So the term gender-based violence reflects the idea that violence often serves to maintain structural gender inequalities. So it includes all types of violence against Native women, children, youth, gay, trans folks, and gender non-conforming relatives. So within this is the definition of the patriarchy, which is a system of society or government in which men hold power and women are largely excluded from it. Women and children are treated as chattel and experience many forms of abuse. And the extension of that is the heteropatriarchy, which is a socio-political system where primarily cisgender males and heterosexuals have authority over cisgender females and folks of varying gender identities and non-heterosexual orientations. One component of gender-based violence that I really want to expand upon is that those who had the reproductive systems to give birth often experience sexual violence because of that ability. And that is a really important way, an important note to understand that throughout history, Native women, like many other Black women and Latino women in the United States have been targeted because of their ability to give birth. And part of that was the experience of like forced sterilization throughout history, as part of this gender-based violence. And so one thing I would really encourage is for folks who do not identify as women to really think about the ways in which this history really impacts our Native women, as well as the toxic masculinity within our communities, and just addressing and holding accountable that behavior to address rape culture and sexual violence. We've covered a lot of this, but what I really want you to take away is that the binary system is a really essential part of the patriarchy and the system that is set up today. The ways in which Native Two-Spirit and LGBTQ Native peoples work against those, the binary and the gender roles we have today is a really huge sign of revitalizing our culture, and just shows that throughout time that despite the impositions we have faced as Native peoples, we have still been able to survive and continue on. So I just want to ask if y'all have any questions about consent or patriarchy or sexual violence, and then also just to ask whether if these definitions assist with understanding sexual violence. Feel free to put it in the chat and just reflect on it. I just want to make sure that we have some time for the videos that I want to share. So for with that, I would like to share with you a video of a Native American woman speaking out on sexual assault and violence. This video really contextualizes what the situation looks like for Native women in the present day. After this, I would like to debrief with you all after we have like a moment to just like take it in, and then we'll have a discussion. So I want to share this video with you. So I'm going to stop my share and then go to the YouTube screen.
I think my suicide attempts started around 8. I thought, if I'm gonna be around drunk people or people molesting me or people raping me, I just wanna leave. I'd rather have strangers do that to me than rather my family. I was about, I would say 6 years old when I first started being molested, but I also was physically and emotionally and mentally abused. I just wanted my pain to stop.
This is Caroline. Caroline is one of the many Indigenous women who are coming forward with their stories of abuse that they didn't know how to report at the time or they didn't feel like they could.
I was being molested by several people, about 5 extended family members. They would come and bring wine, bring beer to my family, to my mother and father, and they would get them drunk and get them to pass out so they could have their way with me. And I was more scared to tell my mom. I was more scared to tell them than anything, so I always kept it to myself. I was mad at my parents too for a while because I thought, why didn't you teach me this? Why didn't you teach me to be safe? And why didn't you teach me about sexual abuse and domestic violence? Well, there was no words for it. Their best way at the time was to be silent, to not bring attention to yourself, because then you might get hurt worse. I didn't know that was a coping skill that they had to use because there was no programs back then.
The old official statistics from the United States Department of Justice were that 1 in 3 American Indian, Alaska Native women were survivors of sexual violence. Recent information that was published by the federal government indicates that more than 50% are survivors of sexual violence and sexual abuse. And as surprising as that statistic sounds, it's actually much worse. When we go into communities and we ask law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, nurses, grandmas, what do you think the percentage of people are in your community that have been raped? And the answer that we most commonly get is somewhere between 80 and 90%.
The violence that currently exists against our people, against our Native women, our children, our elders, it all goes back to trauma, I believe. The trauma that we suffered, the historical trauma, the oppression, taking of our lands, the raping of our women. And this happens throughout Indian country, this whole land that we now call America.
Their idea was to remove us water, gold, copper. You know, they saw the land, they want the land.
But the violence didn't stop when the land was taken. The effects of it are still being felt to this day by the entire people group. When you think about Native women, a lot of that goes back to how we were treated and how we were beaten and how we were raped, and then now trying to restore just some of, get back, you know, who we were as Indigenous people. We are not seen as human. We are not seen as still alive in this generation. We are seen as in museums. We are glorified in movies. We are the Pocahontases of the cartoon, but they don't view us as human, as valuable. And our Native women are therefore then just, you know, they're not worth the effort.
say if a young lady comes to me within 5 days, and she says, I was just raped, I can get the swab and start swabbing her. That's the population we want to hit, with the ones that are afraid to go to the police department, either because they have their own issues with the legal system. And for us, it's just volunteer. We don't get paid to do this. We just volunteer to help them go through the process if they choose to.
Caroline has used her story to help empower other women to share their own. One woman who's been helped by her work and who wishes to remain anonymous in order to speak candidly spoke to us about her childhood.
Being a survivor of sexual molestation, I grew up thinking that I was an object rather than a person. It took away my self-worth, who I was as a woman, and instilled a lot of fear and insecurity in the world. No more shaming, no more blaming, no more judgment. That's what really needs to take place.
To this day, I love my mom, and I can just imagine what they suffered, her and my grandma. Because there was nobody for them at all. There's people for me now today, but there was nobody for them. They didn't have a program, they didn't have a law, they didn't have nothing. But I see our elders, and I thank them so much for surviving so that we could be here, so that we could fight for our children and our grandchildren.
I would just like everyone to take like a deep breath. I know it can be hard to hear like the issues that folks are facing in the present day. But let me connect to my PowerPoint, and we can go to the discussion questions that I have. And in the interest of time, I would just like to encourage you all to reflect on these questions. So just like understand like what are your initial reactions to this video of a survivor speaking out. And then also just to reflect on how does this video connect to the quote from the Columbus crew member. I think it's important to just reflect on consent and just the connection to land, and how colonization really attempted to disrupt that and the way of life that many Native peoples live by.
Floripa, is it okay if we have folks put their thoughts or whatever in the chat for this?
Yeah.
I know we might not have time to read them all out loud, but just so folks can see what people are thinking.
And then, okay, so I just want to discuss a little bit about support for survivors. So this is just using data from some national surveys. And so some of with regards to like informal support, most victims will seek help from family and friends, about 58 to 94%. And then with regards to formal support, there is some access to formal support services. Between 5 to 20% report to law enforcement. About 27 to 40% seek a medical forensic exam, and about 16 to 60% use mental health services. So these are some reasons why a survivor might report. They might have a sense of justice in reporting, or they might need to regain a sense of control of the situation. and also for closure. But I think it's really important to reinforce the agency to the survivor, especially with regards to Native survivors, just really emphasizing their choice in moving forward. So some reasons why a survivor might not report could be a fear of the legal system, some issues with confidentiality and privacy. Sometimes in tribal communities, it can be a very small communal context. And so some survivors are unwilling to share information due to that issue. Another issue could be the relationship to the perpetrator. Sometimes a survivor might fear retaliation or might not feel that they can come forward due to their relationship to the perpetrator. Some tribal communities face barriers to services, such as the rural dynamic of Native communities. There may be a lack of telecommunication infrastructure. And then again, I just want to talk about the confidentiality. But I think it's really important to just center the survivors' wishes for what level of confidentiality they would like to have for what they're going through. So some ways to create supportive spaces for survivors is to really understand what the survivor needs in that moment. And sometimes the needs can be something as like getting food for the survivor or water, and just like some basic needs as well. And then fostering trust with a survivor is really important to create a supportive space, and then meeting them where they are and establishing an affirming space, and also showing up for the survivor. Support that works is really providing non-judgmental support, upholding confidentiality, and really supporting survivor autonomy and self-determination. So the level of privacy is really determined by the survivor, and confidentiality is ultimately your responsibility. I think it's also important to note that you can incorporate culturally responsive safety planning, and just understanding that having support for survivors just really includes understanding the cultural context in which they come from. So in the interest of time, I'm just gonna provide a brief overview of what this video is. This is the Start by Believing campaign resource video, and I can send it to Kelsey after this presentation just so y'all are able to access it. The reason why I like to share this video is because it really shows that it demonstrates the impact of believing a survivor and just really centering survivors when someone discloses that they have been sexually assaulted. So these are some questions to reflect upon, and I can definitely provide the PowerPoint so you can go along with it and incorporate that into your learning after this presentation. Just some pointers for starting the conversation around sexual violence, and also addressing it within tribal communities, is to really talk in your family about the correct names for body parts, understanding body safety, and in that, like fostering understanding of consent, and understanding okay touch and not okay touch, and that private parts are private, and then also fostering open and safe communication where there is no shaming or secrets, and to create that safe space within your families. On a community level, I really want to highlight that the dialogue really starts with us communicating about healthy relationships, boundaries, cultural values, consent, expectations, and online behavior, as well as dating and spiritual and religious values. These really help with understanding at a community level what your expectations are. And I would really extend that to like understanding even what your gender roles are and how you can like work against the patriarchy or work against like rigid binary roles, just to like resist in or to help in preventing sexual violence. And so I want to conclude by saying to continue supporting. I have included the Start by Believing campaign as part of what I want to share with you all as part of what resource you can use to support survivors. I think also seeking out education around trauma-informed approaches to care is a really great way to understand how you can continue supporting survivors. And then I would also say that encouraging sexual violence training to tribal leaders, social workers, healthcare workers, and law enforcement is a really great way to continue advocating for survivors and preventing sexual violence. And so your advocacy can really go beyond your advocate role. I really just want to say I encourage you to watch the Start by Believing video just because it really shows like the ripple effect that we as advocates have, but also just that as survivors speaking out, the support that you can provide to a survivor can really have an impact to others throughout our communities and society. So I want to make sure I have a couple minutes for questions. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. I see one question from Marisol Ramos Cummings. And she said, culturally responsive safety planning, can you give us details with this population in mind? So with regards to culturally responsive safety planning, I think that it's important to understand the context of a given tribal community that the person comes from. So I didn't give it like a specific example just because I think that it really differs per Native person. Sometimes a culturally responsive approach can also mean like providing space for a Native person to practice their culture or to address their healing by incorporating their practices. And so I think that it can show itself in different ways. But for me, like I tend to stay away from like generalizing because so many different communities have a different context and may have like a different expectation around what culturally responsive planning looks like. But I can also provide that research and provide this to Kelsey later on as well. But yeah, otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to provide my contact information as well in case you had any questions. But I just wanted to say, Herkem, thank you so much. I really appreciated all of your participation and just the learning today. So.
If anybody has any other questions, we do have a few minutes left. So please don't hesitate to put in the chat or to unmute yourself and ask Floripa a question.
I also just wanted to give a quick shout out to Jamilet, who was the one who really like spearheaded asking Floripa for this training. Shout out to Jamilet. And also, yeah, we are trying to get in contact with more folks who identify as Indigenous, Native, First Nation in Connecticut, so we can do this work and do a lot of those like Floripa had said, like to not make sure that we're not generalizing, and if we're holding space for folks, especially survivors who are Native, that we're doing that in ways that are actually meaningful. So if you are someone who, or know someone who is Indigenous or Native and happens to live in Connecticut, you can email me or Kelsey, and we would love to talk to you.
Floripa and I were talking about before the training started about the really strong partnerships that Floripa is based in New Mexico. The Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women is based in New Mexico, and that their coalition has really strong partnerships with their local anti-sexual violence and anti-domestic violence coalitions. And so just to echo Nani's request, that is what we're trying to build some of those partnerships here as well. Thank you again, Floripa, so much for being here and sharing this with us today. I think many of us found, in particular, the video that you shared, I think was really, really powerful. And I think I would encourage folks that, if you attended this training with other people from your agency or, people that you know and work with, to continue reflecting on some of the things that we learned today and what you saw in the video and what Floripa shared, because I think there's a lot to sort of sit with and think about the implications for our own work and just who we are in our communities. Thank you so much, everyone. We will send a follow-up email, like Floripa said, with a recording of the training, with the PowerPoint slides, with more resources, I'm sure, as well as our evaluation, which I did put in the chat. So please do that when you get a second. And thank you.